Welcome to Modern World History. This is 1.4, objective or state standard. Evaluate the impact of the collapse of Europe in feudal institutions and the spread of towns on the transmission of goods, people, and ideas in Europe. Remember, in our past lesson we were looking at how the Renaissance and the Crusades had opened up trade, and that allowed for humanism, learning that era, to dominate society. Starting off here, I'm just looking at this picture. It does a pretty good job of explaining how we're talking about, basically about, serfdom here with the peasants, okay, and how they worked for the manor, no education, no freedom, those type things, to medieval commoners. And basically what we're looking at, of course, as it says in here, the spread of towns and town life, better food. We talked about that on the notes the other day as far as agriculture was concerned. Problems with these towns were the dirty and unhealthy and no sewage systems, okay, the spread of disease, and eventually the Black Death would come around here, the spread of Black Death in Europe, 1345 to 1350. And that was through trade, as you know, through rats and fleas and stuff like that. So basically, but what happened here is not going to be erased by the Black Death. They're not going to go backwards to medieval society. So we'll continue with the next slide. I want to take a moment to look through this chart here, medieval life, and when we look at our objective today and how the collapse of European feudal institutions, we're talking about their economic system and their political system are going to be replaced. The lords, the vassals, they're going to be losers in this. I'll put a L here. Okay, the knights are definitely going to be losers in the sense of what happened in the Crusades. The peasants and the serfs are going to be winners, so I'll put the W there, and the kings are going to be winners, okay? The other thing that's going to lose here is going to be the Catholic Church. The church is going to lose a lot of power from this medieval life. The kings are going to gain a lot more power. The Crusades are going to hurt the church, and the Black Death hurts the church, and eventually the Protestant Reformation occurs. The economic system is going to be definitely replaced with a system based off of trade, new jobs in towns, and transmission of goods, people, looking here, people, ideas, and goods in the town areas. So there's going to be a lot of changes. This whole system is going to basically go away. Here's a little picture right here, a nice painting of the lord, the manor, and the castle, and the workers there, and the serfs and stuff like that. So from that medieval time period. So we're going to see some massive changes with the advent of trade, and basically I think the Crusades has a lot to the majority to do with it. All right, this slide we're going to look at the changes in power in the late Middle Ages in Europe, and a couple of things. Let's look at some points here. The feudal levy was unpopular as time went on. By the nobles preferred to pay the king, okay, rather than fight and raise troops. All right, by the nobles doing that, they gave the king power by that change here. Instead of they paying the knights to fight and those kind of things and having the power over them, and also being able to use the knights against the king, now they've reversed that. So they pay the king rather than fight and raise troops. So the king's going to gain power. Armed men were paid a wage, and medieval warfare was financed by taxes and loans. Okay, nobles became weaker. All right. The kings took back their lands and power through this transfer and change of how armies would be financed and who would have the leadership over them. And then centralized governments would be established with these kings. So we look at here, of course, England, and we see France would be developed. Of course, the 100 Years' War would finally separate the two. England basically would be thrown out of France totally, and we'd have two here. And then we have the Holy Roman Empire, the Papal States, and we see these different areas here. So it's really the beginning of what we're going to find out, of course, now naturally countries, but we're talking about kingdoms and royal power, which is going to be one of the main political forces up until the point of the Enlightenment, and then we'll see the revolutions like the American Revolution, the French Revolution, and those things. So that's the change that happened that moved power. Basically, you can look at it from the nobles, okay, to the kings. All right, so you got nobles to the kings here. That power was totally removed. I think, and this is key right here. Nobles to the kings. Increase in European population. The dark areas we see here are the major increase in population, and you see a lot of that. Basically, keep in mind we're looking at trade, and when we do look at trade routes, England, you can see right here in the darker areas, pretty important. As I erase this, we can also look at this part of the Netherlands or Belgium, a little bit northern Germany later, of course. But it's darker areas because they're seaports. Seaports would be very important, and the same thing here. You look at Italy and how well it does. So population increases are pretty important for the establishment of these cities, or excuse me, these towns. The increase in population allowed peasants to leave their medieval manners and search for jobs in towns. And the key here is that the creation of these new jobs were from trade. They moved economies from land-based to money-based economies. So the key is not that having land doesn't mean you don't have wealth, but as time goes on, it's more about being a merchant. It's more about involving yourself in trade. And then we're going to be looking at, of course, banking, okay, and finance. And that's going to become the essence of really economic power, and economic power means political power. This slide is the Crusades and travel during the Middle Ages opened new trade options to England. So as we look here on our state standard, we're talking about the small towns that were developed, and as you see here, all right, some larger, of course, London or Paris, but or Rome. But we see the trade options from, as they're connected from town to town. We're in Eastern Europe here, basically Poland. Here's Krakow, and right there down to Eastern Europe here. Okay, Budapest there, Vienna, and what would be Austria, and then into Germany, which will form later. Of course, it is not there. That's the Holy Roman Empire here, and then France and those things. So there are really some good connections for trade, and then the sea routes, very important. We talked about in the last slide population centers, and a lot of those were in this area in Italy. Okay, and you see the trade routes here, coming from the Black Sea in the east. Okay, here to basically. Important part was Constantinople, and then on through. So you can see these trade routes where ideas and goods would be moved from place to place. And then finally, one of the main points of the standard was London under attack during peasant revolts in 1381, as we see here. Take this slide a little bit, and this is called Tyler's Rebellion. It's significant because it marked basically the end of serfdom in medieval England. And you see the picture here, the burning down, the serfs were revolting during this time period. And that would happen. This is just one revolt, but it would happen all over Europe, where the peasants were rebelling against the manor system, the feudalist system, and would be heading away from these places into towns to some of them to get education and to work for merchants for a better life and those types of things. So peasant revolts became very important to the destruction of this manor system. Okay, just as I said earlier, that the payment of the kings raising the army and paying for the army, the nobles giving up that power, and then really the Crusades, the dominant force to eliminate the nobles' power, the Catholic Church power, while raising the kings. And then we get the modern section, that map I had of the countries. So that's the state standard for tonight's lesson.